A chance encounter. Judge Henry Pearson had always thought of himself as a man of routine. He woke up at the same time every day, had his coffee while reviewing the day's cases, and spent long hours in court, overseeing everything from petty thefts to complex custody battles. He had built a life that felt comfortable, predictable, and under control. Yet, as he walked away from the courthouse that cool autumn evening, a nagging sense of unease tugged at him. The case he had just ruled on, a bitter custody dispute, had drained him emotionally. He couldn't shake the haunting image of a young mother, desperately pleading for her children, while the father sat stoically, refusing to compromise. There had been no winners in the courtroom that day, only the broken pieces of a fractured family. The evening was settling in, the sun just dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Henry loosened his tie as he made his way to the parking lot, grateful for the silence after a long day. He could hear the crunch of leaves beneath his feet and the distant hum of city traffic, but it all felt far away, as though the world had shifted just slightly out of reach. It wasn't the first time he had felt disconnected from the world, but tonight it was more pronounced than usual. Maybe it was because of the case, or perhaps because of the lingering heaviness in his heart. He was no stranger to the emotional toll his work took on him. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he was questioning whether the work he had dedicated his life to truly made a difference. As Henry approached his car, he stopped to glance up at the courthouse building, its imposing stone structure standing tall against the darkening sky. The courthouse had always felt like a second home to him, but tonight, it seemed as if the walls were closing in. He needed a moment to clear his head, a moment to step outside of the courtroom and reconnect with something real, something untainted by the complexities of the law. That's when he heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from behind a large dumpster near the building's service entrance. It was so faint that he almost didn't catch it, but something about it stood out to him. It wasn't the sound of wind or debris. It was deliberate, almost like a whisper. Henry hesitated. Years of experience had taught him to be cautious in situations like this, especially in areas where the public rarely ventured. It could be anyone or anything. Perhaps a stray animal, or a homeless person searching for food or shelter. But despite the caution that had kept him safe in his career, something about the noise pulled at him, compelling him to investigate. He walked closer to the dumpster, his steps tentative at first. The shadows grew deeper around him as the evening settled into twilight, and a chill brushed against his skin. His mind flashed back to the many cases he had handled over the years, each one unique, but all connected by the raw emotions of those involved. Divorce cases, criminal charges, child custody. It all seemed so distant now, as if he were stepping into a different life altogether. The rustling came again, this time louder, followed by a sharp, strained cough. The sound was unmistakable. It was the cough of someone in distress. His heart raced as he approached, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone in case he needed to call for help. But just as he was about to turn the corner, a small voice, barely above a whisper, stopped him. "Please, help." Henry froze. The voice was weak, barely audible, but it sent a shiver down his spine. It sounded like a child. No, two children. He could hear the fear in the voice, and it struck him harder than anything else had all day. He had seen so much suffering in his years on the bench, but something about this moment felt raw, personal. It felt like fate had led him here, to this very spot, at this very moment. "Hello," Henry called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't want to startle whoever, or whatever, was behind the dumpster. He had learned that when dealing with vulnerable individuals, a gentle approach was often the best one. The response came again, faint but clear. "Please, don't leave us." Henry's heart clenched. Without thinking, he moved closer, rounding the corner of the dumpster to find the source of the voice. What he saw left him breathless. Two children, no older than 10 or 11, were curled up together in a pile of tattered blankets. They looked dirty, exhausted, and utterly alone. The boy, who appeared to be the older of the two, had wild brown hair and dirt-streaked skin. His wide eyes were filled with a mix of fear and suspicion. He clutched the smaller girl beside him, who looked even more fragile. She had pale blonde hair, tangled and knotted, and her eyes were swollen from crying. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days. Henry knelt down, trying to hide the shock that was rising inside him. He was used to difficult situations, but this was different. These children weren't statistics or case files. They weren't just victims of circumstance. They were real. They were human beings in desperate need of help. "Hey there," Henry said gently, trying to keep his voice calm. "Are you two okay?" The boy's eyes flicked up to meet his, but he said nothing. The girl, her small hands clutching the boy's arm, shifted slightly but didn't speak either. There was a tense silence before the boy finally spoke, his voice hoarse. We don't have anywhere to go," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, can you help us?" Henry felt his chest tighten. He had seen desperate people in his years as a judge, but this was different. These children were abandoned, lost, and scared. There was no place for them to turn, no one they could rely on. The weight of their words hit him harder than any courtroom decision he had ever made. "Of course I can help," Henry said, his voice firm but filled with compassion. "I won't leave you out here. I'll take care of you. You're safe now." The boy and girl exchanged a brief look, their faces filled with both uncertainty and hope. They didn't seem to fully believe him, but they were too exhausted to argue. They were too tired to fight. Henry stood up, his mind racing. He needed to act fast. Without another word, he helped the boy and girl to their feet, guiding them toward his car. As they walked, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. He had no idea what was ahead, no idea how this story would unfold, but one thing was certain. He would do whatever it took to give these children a chance at a new life. The drive back to his home was quiet, but in the back seat, Henry could hear the soft sounds of the children's breathing. They had fallen asleep, their bodies leaning against the seat in exhaustion. As he looked at them in the rearview mirror, he made a promise to himself. He would protect them. He would give them a home, a place where they could be safe and loved. And somehow, he knew that this decision, this moment, would be the most important one of his life. As Henry pulled into his driveway, he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility settle in his chest. He had no idea what the future held for him or these children, but he knew one thing for certain. They were his family now, and he would do everything in his power to make sure they had a better life than the one they had left behind. Little did Henry know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test the very limits of his capacity for love, patience, and sacrifice. And as the night settled over the city, the first chapter of their new life together began. A home for the twins. Judge Henry Pearson hadn't anticipated that a simple act of kindness would alter the course of his life so dramatically. Taking Ethan and Lily into his home was not a decision he made lightly. It felt like a blur of actions, driven by the urgency of the moment. One minute, he was pulling his car into the driveway, the twins still groggy and confused in the backseat. And the next, he was unlocking his front door, ushering them into a home that felt more like a sanctuary than a mere house. The twins, though exhausted, seemed hesitant as they stepped inside. Their eyes scanned the unfamiliar surroundings, the polished wood floors, the cozy armchairs, the soft lighting that illuminated the living room. They had never known such comfort before. The world they had lived in, a world of harsh streets and fleeting shelters, was starkly different from the warmth of Henry's home. "Do you want something to eat?" Henry asked gently, his voice careful not to overwhelm them. Ethan, the older of the two, looked up at him with wariness in his eyes, as if unsure of the offer. He and Lily had been let down by so many people before. How could they know this wasn't just another empty promise? Lily, on the other hand, tugged at Ethan's sleeve, whispering something that Henry couldn't catch. After a moment, the boy sighed and gave a slight nod, still holding his sister's hand tightly. "We're hungry," Ethan muttered, almost apologetically. It was a stark reminder that food, something so simple to most, had been a luxury they rarely had. Without another word, Henry led them into the kitchen, where the warmth of the oven and the smell of dinner lingered in the air. He had made a simple meal that evening: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and vegetables. But now it felt like the most important meal he would ever serve. As he placed the food on the table, he watched the twins cautiously sit down, their movements stiff and uncertain. They were both painfully thin, their clothes ragged and ill-fitting, evidence of the long months they had spent struggling to survive on the streets. Henry's heart broke for them. He knew that, just as they had learned to survive on their own, they would have to learn to trust again. The journey ahead would not be easy, but he was willing to give them the time they needed. He could only hope that, in time, they would feel at home here, with him. As they began eating, their silence was heavy, filled with the weight of their pasts. Lily ate cautiously, as if afraid to take too much, while Ethan shoveled the food into his mouth quickly, almost as if trying to catch up on years of hunger. Henry sat across from them, watching in silence, unsure of what to say. The house felt small and quiet, yet filled with unspoken words. Eventually, it was Lily who broke the silence. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. She glanced up at Henry, her big blue eyes searching his face for answers. Henry paused, taken aback by the question. It wasn't that he hadn't considered it before. It was just that he hadn't yet found the right words. What could he say? What would make them understand that he wasn't just some stranger who happened to be kind, but that he truly cared about them? That he had made a choice, one that would change all of their lives forever. "I guess I just couldn't leave you two out there alone," Henry replied, his voice quiet but steady. "Everyone deserves to have a place where they're safe, where they're cared for. And I think you two deserve that more than anyone." Ethan and Lily exchanged a brief look, their expressions softening slightly, but they said nothing more. It seemed to be enough for now. They had both been through so much, and trust wasn't something that could be given easily. It would take time. Henry understood that. Over the next few weeks, Henry made every effort to make the twins feel comfortable in their new home. He knew that there was a long road ahead of them, one that would require patience, understanding, and the willingness to meet each day with compassion and care. But despite their initial hesitation, the twins began to settle in, their walls slowly crumbling as they grew accustomed to the small rituals of a normal life. Each morning, Henry would wake them up, help them get dressed, and make breakfast. They had their own rooms now, something they had never had before. At first, Ethan and Lily couldn't sleep through the night. They would wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented, unsure of where they were, as though their minds couldn't quite grasp the concept of security. But Henry would always be there, sitting beside them until they fell back asleep, offering a comforting presence in the darkness. Lily, with her quiet demeanor, had the most difficulty adjusting. She had a tendency to keep to herself, retreating into her own world with her drawings and sketches. It was her way of coping, a way of expressing the things she couldn't say with words. Henry would often find her sitting at the kitchen table, her pencils moving quickly across the paper, capturing moments of her life, images of the city they had left behind, of the places she had once felt safe, of dreams she hadn't yet been able to articulate. Ethan, on the other hand, was more outgoing, though his brashness was often a defense mechanism. He was quick to smile and eager to please, but there was always a guardedness to him, as though he feared that one wrong move might make everything slip away. Henry saw through it, though, and he knew that Ethan just needed to feel like he belonged. Slowly, he opened up, telling Henry stories about the things he had experienced, about the shelters they had stayed in, about the people they had met, and about the things they had lost along the way. Henry listened patiently, never interrupting, always assuring them that he was there for them. There were moments, though, when he felt overwhelmed. He was, After all, just one man and raising 2 children, children who had never known stability, was no small feat. But every time he looked into their eyes, every time he saw them smile or laugh, he was reminded of why he had made this choice. This was his family now, and he would do whatever it took to make sure they had a chance to heal. The twins began attending school, though it wasn't without its challenges. Both were behind in their studies, having missed so much education due to their circumstances. Ethan was quick to pick things up, throwing himself into his studies with enthusiasm. But Lily, who had always been a dreamer, struggled to adjust. She was shy and withdrawn, often retreating into herself when faced with unfamiliar situations. Henry worked with them at home, helping them with their homework, encouraging them to ask questions, and reassuring them that they weren't alone. It was during these quiet moments, sitting together at the kitchen table, working through math problems, or reading together before bed, that Henry realized just how much he had come to love these children. They were no longer strangers to him. They had become his children, his family, and he would do whatever it took to make sure they knew they were loved. As the weeks turned into months, Henry noticed something remarkable happening. The twins, who had once been wary of the world around them, began to trust again. They started to feel the warmth of their new home, the stability that came with knowing they were safe. Lily began to speak more, to share her thoughts and ideas with Henry. Her art, which had once been a solitary escape, became a way for her to connect with the world, to express herself in ways that words could not. Ethan, too, began to flourish. His confidence grew as he excelled in school, making friends for the first time in years. He had always been the protector of Lily, but now he was beginning to see the world with new eyes. Eyes that saw possibilities rather than barriers. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Henry realized that this was what it meant to be a family. It wasn't about blood or genetics. It wasn't about the past or the mistakes that had been made along the way. It was about love. It was about the commitment to stand by one another, to protect one another, no matter what. As Henry watched the twins laugh together, as they shared stories of their day, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had given them a home, yes, but in return, they had given him something far more valuable. They had given him a second chance to be the father he never thought he could be. And that, he realized, was the most precious gift of all. Unveiling the past. The months that followed Henry's decision to take Ethan and Lillian were filled with the kind of quiet joy he had never imagined possible. His home, once an echoing space filled with the sounds of solitude, had transformed into a vibrant haven for his new family. The twins, once lost and uncertain, were beginning to find their footing. They laughed more, played more, and even started to open up in ways Henry hadn't expected. But as with all good things, there was an undercurrent, a shadow that had been lingering just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to surface. It was a late afternoon when the storm finally arrived. Henry had just returned home from a particularly trying day in court. A civil case had dragged on longer than expected, and the exhaustion weighed heavily on him. The first thing he did when he entered the house was shed his coat and shoes and head for the kitchen to grab something to eat. But as he passed the living room, he noticed Ethan sitting alone on the couch, his eyes focused on something in his hands. It was an old photo, one that seemed out of place in this home full of new beginnings. "Ethan," Henry called softly, stepping into the room. The boy didn't react at first, his thumb absent-mindedly flipping the edges of the photo. But when Henry approached, Ethan finally looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and something deeper, a memory trying to surface. Henry took a seat beside him. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ethan hesitated before answering, his fingers still gripping the edges of the photo as if he were afraid to let it go. "I found it in the drawer of the old desk upstairs," he murmured. "I was looking for something, but I didn't expect to find this." The photo was a faded, creased image of a woman and 2 small children. Ethan and Lily, though younger in the picture, were unmistakable, their innocent faces staring back at him. The woman in the photo, her dark hair and soft smile, was unfamiliar, though there was something in her eyes that seemed vaguely familiar to Henry. "Is this your mother?" Henry asked carefully. Ethan nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. "Yeah, that's her. Her name was Sarah." The name felt like a distant memory, though Henry couldn't place why. Sarah was a name that lingered in his mind like a song he couldn't quite remember the words to, something that seemed important yet far away. He had never asked the twins much about their past. When they had arrived, both of them had been too traumatized to talk, and Henry didn't want to push them into a painful recollection. But now, with the photo in his hands, it felt like the time to ask, to know more about the life they had left behind. Ethan's eyes hardened, a protective veil falling over his face. "We don't talk about her much," he said, his voice tight. We don't remember much. She disappeared when we were little. And after that, it was just me and Lily. We had to survive on our own." The air in the room seemed to shift, and Henry could feel the weight of the unspoken words pressing in on him. There was so much more to their story than they had let on. And in that moment, he realized that the twins' silence wasn't just a result of the trauma they had endured. It was the silence of something far more painful, something they had never been able to confront. Henry cleared his throat, trying to offer some comfort in his voice. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. But if you ever do, I'm here for you, okay?" Ethan nodded but said nothing. The photo still sat between them, its faded edges somehow representing the gaps in their lives, the pieces of their past they couldn't put together. Henry placed it gently on the coffee table and left Ethan to his thoughts, feeling the quiet tension in the room linger long after he had walked away. Later that evening, after dinner, Henry was sitting at the kitchen table when Lily wandered in, her eyes red and puffy. She had been quiet all day, more withdrawn than usual, and her unease was impossible to ignore. Henry had hoped the worst of her anxieties had passed, but something had shifted in her since she had seen the photo with Ethan. "Lily?" Henry asked gently, pushing back from the table. "What's going on?" The girl didn't answer right away. She stood by the doorframe, her small figure silhouetted against the dimming light outside. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Are we really safe here, Henry?" she asked, her words trembling as if she were unsure of their meaning. "What if our past catches up with us? What if the people who hurt us come looking for us?" The question struck Henry like a punch to the gut. He had never wanted to lie to them, but he had promised himself he would give them the security they so desperately needed. The truth was that he didn't know. He didn't know who had hurt them, why they had ended up on the streets, or what secrets lingered in their past. But what he did know was that he would protect them with everything he had. "You're safe here," he said firmly, walking over to where she stood and crouching down to her level. "No one is going to hurt you, Lily. I won't let them." Lily didn't seem convinced. She looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt and fear, before finally letting her gaze fall to the floor. "But what if someone comes and takes us away?" The weight of her question seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud. Henry took a deep breath and stood up, walking over to the window that overlooked the yard. The streetlights outside flickered softly in the growing darkness. He turned back to Lily, his heart heavy with the realization that the twins were far from healed. Their lives had been upended by forces he didn't understand, and it was only a matter of time before their past caught up with them. "I won't let anyone take you away from here, Lily," he said with quiet determination. "But we might need to learn more about your past, to make sure we can keep you safe." Lily didn't respond, but the sadness in her eyes seemed to lift slightly, as though a small part of her finally believed him. She didn't ask any more questions that night, but Henry could see the lingering unease in her. He had promised to protect them. But now it seemed as though the shadows of their past were beginning to claw at the edges of their new life. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Henry found himself unable to ignore the growing sense of urgency surrounding the twins' past. The photo, the whispered questions, and the fear in their eyes all pointed to something darker, a history filled with secrets that neither of them seemed ready to face. But Henry couldn't turn away. He couldn't just pretend that their past didn't matter. One evening, after putting the twins to bed, Henry sat at his desk, staring at the photograph once more. He had reached out to the local authorities, hoping they could help him find out more about the twins' mother, Sarah. But the more he dug into their past, the more complicated things became. There were no clear answers. The file was sparse, and the people Henry reached out to spoke in hushed tones, offering him fragments of a story that made little sense. As Henry sat there, a thought struck him like a thunderclap. What if the twins' past wasn't just something they had to face? It was something that had never fully let them go. What if Sarah's disappearance had been no accident, but part of a much larger, darker story? He didn't know yet, but he was determined to find out. And with that resolve, Henry knew that the journey ahead would be far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The bonds he had built with the twins were strong, but their history, filled with secrets, would soon demand answers that could change everything. The buried truth. The days following Henry's decision to probe deeper into Ethan and Lily's past were filled with an increasing sense of urgency and dread. The quiet days they had spent adjusting to their new lives began to feel like the calm before a storm. Every time Henry looked at the twins, he saw a mixture of vulnerability and resilience, an unspoken plea for answers that only the past could provide. But the more he searched, the more elusive the truth became. The file on Sarah, their mother, had been nearly empty. There were no records of her death or any indication of why she had disappeared. What little Henry had gathered from local authorities was fragmented, disjointed, as though someone had deliberately erased or obscured the details. Despite the lack of information, one thing was clear. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure Sarah's story remained buried. One evening, after another fruitless search through local records, Henry found himself alone in the dim light of his study, staring at the photo of Sarah and the twins once more. He had tried to piece together the puzzle, but the fragments he had weren't enough. The truth felt out of reach, like a puzzle with missing pieces. And then, in a flash, something clicked. It was an old memory, a distant echo from his years as a judge, a case he had heard years ago. He couldn't place the details at first, but there was a feeling that gnawed at him, something that connected to the photo in his hands, something he could no longer ignore. He pulled his laptop toward him and began sifting through old court cases. His mind wandered back to a particularly disturbing case, a custody battle that had involved a woman named Sarah, a name he had heard only once before. His hands trembled slightly as he typed the name into the search bar. As the documents loaded, Henry's heart skipped a beat. The case from years ago wasn't a typical custody dispute. The more he read, the more unsettling it became. The woman, Sarah, had been involved in a complex situation that involved not just a bitter divorce, but also allegations of abuse, drugs, and something even more dangerous, ties to a criminal organization that Henry could never have imagined. The case had been a quiet one, wrapped in layers of secrecy, and Henry had been told not to speak of it. At the time, he had assumed it was just another tragic family dispute. But now, knowing what he knew, he realized that Sarah's life, and by extension, Ethan and Lily's, was far darker than he could have ever anticipated. The case had been sealed for a reason. Henry sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the revelation sinking in. He had been a judge for long enough to know when something didn't add up. Now it seemed that the missing pieces were finally beginning to fall into place. Sarah hadn't disappeared. She had run. She had been forced to leave everything behind to protect her children from something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. But who had been behind it? And why had they kept her hidden for so long? His thoughts raced. He couldn't let the twins know what he had uncovered. Not yet. Not until he had more answers. He had promised them safety, a chance to live without fear. But now, the reality of their situation was more precarious than ever before. As if on cue, The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Ethan appeared in the doorway, looking at Henry with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice hesitant as he stepped inside the room. Henry quickly minimized the window on his laptop, masking the case file that had consumed his attention. He looked up at Ethan, his face forced into a calm expression that didn't quite meet his eyes. "I'm fine," Henry said with a forced smile, standing up and walking over to the boy. "Just doing some work. What's on your mind?" Ethan stood still for a moment, his gaze shifting toward the desk, then back to Henry. "You've been acting weird lately. You're not thinking about sending us back, are you?" The question took Henry by surprise. It was the first time either of the twins had mentioned anything remotely close to their past life, the one they had left behind. Henry's heart sank, the weight of the unspoken fear hanging in the air between them. "No," Henry replied, his voice steady. "I'm not going to send you back. You're home here. Both of you are safe." Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained skeptical. He had seen too much of the world to take Henry's assurances at face value. "It's just, I keep thinking about the things we left behind. Things I don't remember, but that I feel deep down. What if they come looking for us?" Henry hesitated. Ethan's question echoed the same fears that had been gnawing at him, the same fears that had driven him to dig deeper into their past. But how could he explain any of it to Ethan? How could he tell him that there was something much darker at play here, something that could tear their fragile family apart? Instead, Henry took a deep breath and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, looking him in the eyes. "I don't know what happened before, but I do know one thing. You're here now, and nothing is going to change that. We'll face whatever comes together. That's a promise." Ethan studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay." Henry watched him leave the room, his heart heavy with the burden of the truth he couldn't yet share. He knew that Ethan and Lily's past was far from over, but he also knew that, no matter what, he would protect them. Over the following days, the weight of the secrets Henry had uncovered began to eat at him. His mind raced with questions. Was there someone out there still looking for Ethan and Lily? Had Sarah been running from a dangerous past, or had she been involved in something much bigger than he had ever imagined? And most importantly, could he shield the twins from the danger that now seemed to loom over them? As the days passed, Henry grew more cautious. He kept a closer eye on the twins, watching for any signs of unease or discomfort. He knew that whatever was coming, it would not be easy. The more he learned about Sarah's past, the more he realized that the shadows of the past were closing in on them, and that he would need to find answers, and fast, before they could be swept up in a web of danger they weren't prepared for. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned dark, Henry received an unexpected phone call. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something about it made him pick up the phone without hesitation. "Hello," Henry said, his voice steady despite the unease settling in his stomach. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then a low, gravelly voice spoke. "You're digging into things you shouldn't be, Pearson," the voice said, dripping with a cold menace. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Stop looking into Sarah. Stop looking into the kids." Henry's heart pounded in his chest. He recognized the threat immediately. It was real. Someone was watching, and they were not going to stop until the past was left untouched. But Henry wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice firm, though his hands clenched into fists. "I'm protecting them now. You'll have to go through me first." The line went dead with a click, but the threat hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Henry stood still for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand. He knew one thing for sure now. The twins' past wasn't just a mystery. It was a threat, and it was coming for them. The game had changed. And now Henry would have to fight not only to protect Ethan and Lily, but to uncover the truth that could destroy them. The price of secrets. The phone call had rattled Henry to his core, but it also sparked something in him that had been dormant for years, a resolve, a determination to see this through no matter the cost. The calm facade he had been trying to maintain for Ethan and Lily began to crack, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before the past would come crashing down around them. He had no choice now. The deeper he went, the more he realized just how entwined their lives were with a world of danger, secrecy, and violence. The following days were spent on high alert. Henry had placed extra precautions around the house. Motion sensors, security cameras, and even a deadbolt on the back door. He hadn't told the twins about the call. They were still adjusting to their new lives, and he didn't want to burden them with the growing tension that hung in the air. But his sense of unease grew with each passing hour. The feeling of being watched lingered like a constant weight on his shoulders. Ethan and Lily, for their part, seemed to be feeling the shift too. They weren't as carefree as they had been before. The laughter that had once filled the house had become quieter, more reserved. Ethan, especially, had become withdrawn, spending more time in his room, poring over old books or staring out the window, lost in thought. Lily, ever the more sensitive of the two, kept close to Henry, watching him with eyes that seemed to understand more than he could say. One evening, as Henry was preparing dinner, Lily approached him, her footsteps hesitant, her eyes filled with an unspoken question. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, twisting her hands nervously. "Henry," she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening? I know something's wrong. I can feel it." Henry stopped what he was doing and turned to face her, the weight of her question pressing on him like a vice. It wasn't the first time she had sensed the growing tension, but it was the first time she had voiced it so directly. He knew he couldn't lie to her. Not now. Not when the storm was closing in. I'm looking into something, Lily," Henry said, choosing his words carefully. "Something from your past. I don't want to scare you, but I need to know more about what happened before you came here. There are people out there who are dangerous, and I need to make sure we're safe." Lily's eyes widened, her face pale. "Dangerous? But I thought we were safe here." Henry walked over to her, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. "You are safe here," he reassured her gently. "I promise you, no one is going to hurt you. I'm doing everything I can to make sure of that." Lily bit her lip, looking down at the floor for a moment, her mind clearly processing the weight of his words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice small but resolute. "I don't want to go back to the way things were, Henry," she said, almost pleading. "I don't want to remember what happened. I just want to be happy here, with you and Ethan." The sincerity in her voice struck Henry hard. He had promised them both a life away from the horrors they had known, a chance to rebuild and heal. But the ghosts of their past were proving to be much harder to outrun than he had hoped. He placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "I know, Lily, and we won't go back to that. I'll make sure of it," he said, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of the promise he had made. She nodded, though the uncertainty in her eyes remained. Henry stood up, feeling the burden of the secret he was keeping from her. He wasn't ready to tell her everything. Not yet. The truth would be too much for her to bear, and he didn't want to rob her of the peace she had found here. Not until he was certain that they were truly safe. Later that evening, after dinner, Henry retreated to his study, his mind racing with the new information he had uncovered about Sarah's past. He had managed to track down a few more details, a name, an address, and a connection to a figure in the city's underground world. A man named Vincent Rojas. The name had sent a chill down Henry's spine. Rojas was a known associate of several criminal organizations, a man with a reputation for ruthless tactics and an ability to make people disappear without a trace. The realization hit Henry like a thunderclap. Sarah hadn't just run from an abusive relationship or a failed marriage. She had been running from a powerful criminal network that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And now, it seemed, they had come back for her children. As Henry dug deeper into Rojas's background, His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. He turned to see Ethan standing there, his face unreadable. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, his voice low and tense. Henry gestured for him to come in, setting the laptop aside. "Of course, Ethan. What's on your mind?" Ethan stepped into the room, his eyes darting around as if searching for something he couldn't quite put into words. I don't know how to say this, but I think I remember something. Something about what happened to Mom." Henry's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the past would force its way to the surface. But hearing Ethan say the words out loud made it all the more real. Henry leaned forward, his expression serious. "What do you remember, Ethan?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though a sense of dread was building in his chest. Ethan took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't know all of it, but there were men. Bad men. They came to our house when I was little. Mom was trying to protect us, but she couldn't. I don't know what happened, but I remember the fear in her eyes, and then we were running. We never stopped running." Henry felt his stomach twist. The pieces were falling into place, but they didn't fit together in any way that offered him any comfort. Sarah hadn't just disappeared. She had been forced to disappear, to keep her children safe from a world they hadn't even begun to understand. And now that world was closing in on them once again. "What else do you remember, Ethan?" Henry asked, his voice tight with the urgency of the situation. Ethan shook his head, his eyes clouded with confusion. "I don't know. It's all foggy. But I think I heard her say something. Right before we left the last place, she said something about Vincent Rovis. And about a debt that couldn't be paid." The name sent a chill through Henry's veins. Rojas wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was the key to everything. If Sarah had been involved with him, and if that debt had never been paid, then there was no telling how far the reach of the past extended. Henry sat back in his chair, the weight of the situation sinking in. He had known that there were dangerous people involved, but now it seemed that the danger had become personal. Ethan and Lily weren't just victims of circumstance. They were pawns in a larger game that Henry had no intention of losing. But to protect them, he would have to face the very people who had taken their mother from them, and the people who were now coming for them. The phone call from earlier, the threats, and the new revelations about Rojas, they all pointed to one inescapable truth. The fight for the twins' safety had only just begun. Henry stood up, a sense of determination flooding him. He had already risked everything to give these children a future. Now he would do whatever it took to make sure they had one. A future free from the past that threatened to destroy everything they had built. But first, he had to face the ghosts of that past, and he had to do it soon, before it was too late. Confronting the past. The days blurred into one another as the pressure mounted on Henry. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they revealed was not one he wanted to see. Ethan's fragmented memories had shed light on the truth. Sarah's past was not just a story of survival, but of entanglement with forces far more dangerous than Henry had ever imagined. And now, those forces were coming for the twins. The phone call had been a warning, but it had also solidified Henry's resolve. If there was one thing he knew for certain, it was that he wasn't going to back down, not when the lives of Ethan and Lily were on the line. He had promised them safety, and he would keep that promise, even if it meant facing a past he hadn't been prepared for. The first step was clear. Henry had to find Vincent Rovis. He had to confront the man who had caused so much pain in Sarah's life, and by extension, in the lives of Ethan and Lily. But finding Rojas wasn't going to be easy. The man was a ghost, elusive and deeply embedded in the criminal underworld. Henry knew that the only way to get to him was to follow the threads Sarah had left behind. Armed with the information Ethan had given him, Henry began his search, reaching out to old contacts in law enforcement and using every connection he had built over the years to track down leads. The search was slow and painstaking, but with each passing day, he inched closer to uncovering the truth. One morning, after a long night of research, Henry received a call that made his heart race. The voice on the other end was familiar. Detective Laura Jensen, an old friend from his days on the bench. Laura had always been sharp, and if anyone could help him navigate the web of secrecy that surrounded Rojas, it was her. "Henry," Laura's voice crackled over the line. "I've got something for you. It's not much, but it's a lead on Rojas. I think I'd found where he's hiding." Henry's pulse quickened. "Where? Tell me." "There's a warehouse district on the outskirts of town," Laura continued. "It's been abandoned for years, but I've traced a few shipments to that area. Illegal stuff, human trafficking, weapons. Rojas's name keeps popping up. I think he's using it as a base." Henry's mind raced as he processed the information. The thought of confronting Rojas in a place like that sent a shiver down his spine. But he knew this was his chance. This was the only lead he had, and he couldn't afford to wait any longer. "I'm going there," Henry said, his voice firm. "Be careful," Laura warned. "Rojas doesn't leave loose ends. If he's involved, you're walking into a hornet's nest." Henry didn't need to hear more. He already knew the risks, but he had made a promise to Ethan and Lily. He wouldn't let them down. Within the hour, Henry was in his car, heading toward the outskirts of town. The warehouse district loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, a cluster of dilapidated buildings that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The air was thick with tension, and Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He parked his car a few blocks away, careful not to draw attention to himself. The shadows stretched long as he approached the warehouse. It was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel. He surveyed the area, noting the lack of security, the faded signs of activity. It looked like the kind of place that had been abandoned long ago, yet Henry had a gut feeling that Rojas had turned it into something much more dangerous. The front door was slightly ajar, and Henry slipped inside, his senses on high alert. The darkness inside swallowed him whole, the air stale and musty. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, illuminating old crates, rusted machinery, and broken windows. But there was no sign of life. At least, not at first. As he moved deeper into the building, he heard a sound, a faint creaking, like footsteps on the floor above him. His heart raced, and he immediately crouched low, listening carefully. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Someone was moving. Henry's hand instinctively reached for the gun he had tucked in his belt. He had hoped to avoid confrontation, but it seemed that wasn't an option. He crept forward, moving quietly through the darkened warehouse, his eyes scanning every corner. The faint creaking of footsteps stopped suddenly. Henry's pulse quickened. He knew he was close. Then, from the shadows, a voice called out, sharp and commanding. "You shouldn't have come here, Pearson." Henry froze. His breath caught in his throat. It was him, Vincent Rojas. The man stepped into the dim light, his presence imposing. Rojas was a tall, wiry figure with sharp features and cold eyes that seemed to pierce through Henry's very soul. He wore a black suit, his expression unreadable, but there was something about him, an air of arrogance, of power, that made Henry's blood run cold. "I've been waiting for you," Rojas said, his voice low, almost mocking. "I was wondering how long it would take before you started digging. But now that you're here, well, it's too late." Henry stood his ground, though his mind raced. He had expected this moment, but facing Rojas in person, knowing how dangerous he was, made it all the more real. He refused to show any fear. "I'm here for the twins, Rojas," Henry said, his voice steady. "I'm not leaving without them." Rojas chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "The twins? You think you can just waltz in here and take them from me? You don't know who you're dealing with." Henry's jaw tightened. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You've been pulling the strings from the shadows for years, Rojas, but I'm done running. I'm done letting you destroy lives." Rogis's smile faded, replaced by a cold, dangerous look. "You don't understand, Pearson. This is bigger than you, bigger than the twins. This is about power, and you're in my way." Before Henry could react, two men emerged from the shadows, flanking Rogis on either side. They were both armed, their eyes cold and calculating. Henry's hand tightened on his gun, but he knew he couldn't take on 3 men alone, not in a place like this. "You made a mistake coming here," Rogis continued, his voice laced with venom. "But it's not too late for you to turn around. Leave now, and maybe I'll let you walk out of here with your life." Henry's grip on his gun tightened. There was no going back now. He had come too far to back down. He had to protect the twins, even if it meant facing Rogis head-on. "I'm not leaving without them," Henry said, his voice unwavering. "I'm taking them home." The air between them crackled with tension. The next moments were a blur. Rogis's men moved toward him, but Henry was faster, his training kicking in as he dodged and fired. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to survive. Each movement was calculated, each step driven by a single goal: get the information he needed and leave with the twins, no matter the cost. In the chaos of the moment, Henry's mind raced. He needed to find out what Rogis was hiding. But as the fight escalated, he realized that the truth he sought was far more dangerous than he had imagined, and he had just scratched the surface. When the dust settled, the warehouse was silent once more. Henry stood over Rogis's unconscious body, his chest heaving with adrenaline. But he wasn't done yet. The real battle had just begun. As he stepped forward, his thoughts returned to Ethan and Lily. The danger was far from over. And now, it seemed that there were more forces at play than he had ever anticipated. But one thing was certain: he would stop at nothing to protect the children he had promised to keep safe. The darkness was closing in, but Henry Pearson was ready for whatever came next.